Hello and welcome to North Country Matters. My name is Donna Seymour. I'm a member of the St. Lawrence County League of Women Voters, one of the civic partners for our show. My guest today is Seher Khawaja. She's the Director of Economic Justice and Deputy Legal Director for the Women's Legal Defense and Education Fund, also known as legalmomentum.org. Seher, welcome to North Country Matters. With all the threats that women in the workforce, especially women of color, continue to face with high rates of pay discrimination, not to mention the rapid changes at the federal level to the programs that used to protect workers, this is a great time to have you on the show to talk about these issues.
Thank you, Donna. It's such a privilege to be here with you today.
Well, the privilege is mine, believe me. So you and I work together on the Equal Pay Committee of powernewyork.org. Please take a moment to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be doing this important work at Legal Momentum.
Well, so I'm going to start with a little background on Legal Momentum. Legal Momentum is a nonprofit civil rights organization dedicated to advancing the rights of women, advancing gender equality. We are one of the longest serving organizations that has been doing so. It's over 50 years now. And a lot of our work does focus on, we have multiple pillars. A lot of our work focuses on advancing economic justice and workplace equality. And in that context, we've done a lot of work in the area of pay equity. I have a background in international human rights and economic development, and the way that I've always been interested in kind of the way those two intersect with each other. And I think also with a focus on the rights of the most underserved or marginalized within any community. And I think I've worked in a wide range of countries in a wide range of settings and issues. And I think irrespective of the country, one thing that is consistent across the board is that women always fall among that group of the most underserved, the most marginalized, the most economically insecure. And so I was very lucky to land at Legal Momentum and move up towards being able to lead our work on economic justice. And I think one of the things I'm most proud of there is just having worked in coalition with Power New York and other partners to really build out our equal pay laws to make them more meaningful.
Right. And in this day and age, equal pay laws, although they have a lot of work left to do, are an important starting point, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I always say our equal pay laws are absolutely essential, even though they are not sufficient to get the job done.
Well, unfortunately, that always seems that laws follow the need as opposed to getting in front of it. So as we watch worker protections disappear at the federal level in real time, day by day, we still have robust protections here in New York State. So let's go through some of those so folks will know about their all-important rights. Let's start by talking about equal pay for substantially similar work. What does that phrase mean?
So I want to back up
Oh,
a
sorry.
moment, Tommy, just to even talk about, I think a lot of our state laws come from a recognition that our federal laws are not cutting it. And so at the federal level, we have the Equal Pay Law, the Equal Pay Act of 1963. And what that requires is equal pay for equal work based on gender. That's just a simplification of that statute. But ultimately, the way courts have interpreted that law over time is to really set a very high burden for people to demonstrate pay inequity, because what they end up looking for is essentially like identical jobs, people who are doing exactly the same thing as their male counterpart. And if you're not doing the exact same thing, you're not going to meet the burden. And I think what you find, and as we know, is that in so many circumstances, people are not going to be doing exactly the same job, but they're being paid substantially less for doing essentially the same job. And so I think what we did in New York is to amend that language from equal pay for equal work to equal pay for substantially similar work. And the purpose of that was to get around that high threshold and recognition of the fact that pay equity exists in jobs that are substantially similar, but where people are doing identical jobs, because that's just an unrealistic threshold. And what courts and agencies are really looking at are multiple factors, from kind of skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions, to see that they're substantially similar when comparing one job to another.
And of course, what we saw through time was that job descriptions were massaged to make them look like they were different set of circumstances, when in fact, in reality, the actual work was the same.
Absolutely. And so I think it's really important to be able to have that flexibility to dig deeper, to get a true sense of whether or not people are doing essentially the same job but being paid less.
Yes.
Oh, and
So,
one thing I want
oh,
to
sure.
mention, Donna, I'm sorry, is that I think one of the things that's also worth calling out about our New York law, and our New York law is better than federal law in a number of respects, but the one thing I want to point out is that it doesn't just protect against pay inequity based on gender. It covers all the protected characteristics that are under our New York State law. So that, and there are a number of protected classifications, from age, race, national origin, et cetera.
Right. Disability would be another one, I would assume. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Sexual
Okay.
orientation, gender identity.
So a new law in New York State that took effect just 2 years ago in 2023. Tell us more about what the pay transparency in jobs postings means for workers and how it works.
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially what our New York State pay transparency law does, and this is something we're very proud of, is it requires employers with 4 or more employees to post a salary or wage range in job postings for new jobs, transfers, and promotions. And so this is really a game changer. I think one of the things we've seen over time is that, the equal pay laws require workers to, one, identify a pay disparity, and two, to then challenge it legally, right? And there are a lot of costs associated with that, but also under our previously prevailing culture of pay secrecy, people just didn't know what people were being paid for what. And so I think the purpose of this type of law is twofold. It has multiple purposes, but I think two of the main purposes are, one, to empower workers with information that they didn't previously have. I think people of color and women historically have artificially depressed wages based on discrimination. And so when they are going into a salary negotiation, they really have nothing to utilize apart from oftentimes that prior depressed salary. And from the get-go, they are negotiating against themselves. And so that kind of perpetuates the wage gap right there. And so by having access to salary ranges before you go into that whole process, one, you have more power to choose which jobs, which industries you're going to pursue, but then you also have the power to advocate for yourself more effectively. I think the second piece that we don't talk enough about, and is almost more important, is that the purpose of this type of law is to change the way employers pay, and to change the way they set salary. I think previously we were in an environment where employers were engaging in this ad hoc process where they were deciding someone's salary based on who walks in the door, how they're able to advocate for themselves. And oftentimes that has resulted in the infusion of implicit biases against women, implicit biases against people of color, which we know are very prominent in this atmosphere. And so by requiring employers to set the pay range up front before candidates walk in the door, it really forces them, as I always say, to price the job and not the person, so that they are really focusing on what are the qualifications, what are the skills, what effort is required to go into this job, and what's our budget. These are things that, are really best practices in terms of how you set salary, and the goal of the law is also to really drive that.
Yes, I've seen a lot of local ads that use those kinds of things. And really, it also helps employers because certainly anytime employers are competing for too few employees, then if they can offer a competitive salary and they know that the person who's taking the job meets the requirements, it's much easier on both of them to find that right person who's not going to just hop and jump to the next job, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's proven to be a more effective, efficient way of hiring. It also, among employees, increases trust. I think across the board, workers feel better at working for an employer where they feel like the pay practices are fair. I think it's also worth noting for lower wage workers, it is a critical tool, both in terms of, you know, empowering workers who, and the this information is meant to be posted not just in kind of formal online posting. It's meant to be going up in job store windows, job
Mhm.
postings in store windows and things like that. And so it allows lower wage workers to identify, which are the employers who are paying the minimum wage, who's paying more than the minimum wage, and I think that's a really important piece of it. And to the extent employers are not engaging in those postings, we really need to be pushing them to be doing so.
Right. And I think the other thing it does is that it helps employees understand what they need to do to make themselves more employable, because there are a set of criteria and a set of rubrics. And if you don't quite meet it, you can get out and get the education or the experience you need to qualify for the higher paying job. So really, it benefits both employees and employers all the way across the board.
Absolutely.
So, of course, talking to others about pay ranges is a critical part of finding out if you're being paid fairly. For years, employers had the upper hand in stopping that kind of conversation. How has the freedom to discuss and disclose pay given workers an important advantage in seeking that fair wage?
Sure. So again, I'll take a step back and start at the federal level. The National Labor Relations Act, it's at the federal level, provides protections for a lot of employees to discuss their pay or salary with their coworkers. It's something that a lot of workers don't know about, but also there are some loopholes. It doesn't apply to everybody. But I think because there is such a lack of awareness in the space, it was really important that in New York State we passed a separate, distinct law that made it very clear that workers' rights to discuss salary with their coworkers was protected. That's essentially what the law does. It means that workers can discuss their salary. They can ask their coworkers about their wages. I can't stress, and despite the fact that workers do not have to engage in those conversations if they do not choose to or respond to inquiries. I can't stress how important this protection is because, like I said, in we have been living under this cloud of pay secrecy for so long that so many workers, including the renowned Lilly Ledbetter, don't know when they're being paid less than their male counterparts. And oftentimes what we're finding is that our clients and people who come through us have oftentimes found out by asking their coworkers who are doing exactly the same job as them.
Yeah, and that's really, it's an absolutely critical piece of information if you're going to be able to fairly price your worth in the workplace. So in the event that you do discover that you've been paid unfairly, you have the right to sue. There are some things that people can do, but it often meant that the employer could retaliate against you. How does the New York Freedom from Retaliation protection work for workers?
So what we know is that, and I think something to keep in mind is that the retaliation rates are oftentimes incredibly high. Retaliation is very common, and that also makes these laws very, again, costly and difficult to utilize because people are afraid, and rightly so. And so one thing we've been working on is just really enhancing our anti-retaliation protections, um, both to provide the protection, but also to discourage employers from and to really disincentivize employers from engaging in retaliation. I think anti-retaliation protections exist across our laws, our general anti-discrimination laws, the Equal Pay Act, specifically with respect to discussing pay, with respect to gaining access to the salary range information. Anti-retaliation provisions apply across the board. I think one thing that's really important for people to keep in mind is that even though these protections exist, employers are still going to retaliate in certain circumstances. But in those circumstances, you not only have a claim for the underlying discrimination, you have a claim for the retaliation. And oftentimes it can be easier to win a claim on a retaliation claim than it can be to prove the underlying discrimination.
Interesting. So one of the big stumbling blocks for getting information on what to ask for salary when you're doing the negotiating for a job is that employers have wanted to know what you were making in your last job, which could often set an unfairly low floor, particularly if you were underpaid. So how have the prohibitions against the use of pay history changed that practice?
I'm glad you asked about the salary history bans, Donna. This is a really important law. We're seeing them pop up more and more across the country. Essentially and we call them salary history bans, and essentially what these laws do and what our law in New York State does in particular is it prohibits employers from asking about or relying upon someone's salary history during the hiring process. And I think, as you mentioned, Donna, why we know this is critically important because, and I talked about this earlier, is that for women and people of color, there's been so much discrimination integrated into salary setting that most likely most women and people of color are coming to the table with a depressed salary to begin with. And so when employers base their future salary on that, artificially depressed salary based on discrimination, we end up perpetuating that discrimination further. And so I think it's a critical law, and also combined with the pay transparency law really helps empower workers to push against that trend.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I was going to ask a question too, Seher. How does New York state law compare to other states? Are we leading the charge? Are we behind other states? Where are we in this spectrum?
I think that's a great question. I mean, I think that New York deserves a lot of credit for having a fair number of progressive laws on the books in many of these areas. I think we've done a lot of work in strengthening our equal pay laws. And so the fact that we have a more robust Equal Pay Act, the fact that we have a salary transparency law, we have a salary history ban, we protect workers from discussing salary. These are all critically important. I think compared to, but we are seeing other states do really important work. Colorado was one of the states that led the push for pay transparency, and then New York City is where we initiated the first efforts to kind of implement similar types of protections. And so I think New York leads in many ways, but we also have a lot to learn from other states, and sometimes it's unexpected places where we're gonna identify how to put in place meaningful protections. I think, we talked earlier about like equal pay laws are only one piece of the puzzle. And I think as we think about pay equity for workers, one of the key things we have to really, really invest in is occupational segregation, this trend of where, the structural trend where women, largely women of color, have been steered and pushed into lower wage occupations. And I think when we talk about pay equity initiatives, a lot of that has to do with really engaging in legislative efforts to increase wages in female-dominated industries. I know those efforts are underway in the home care industry and the child care industry here in New York. We need movement there that's not being made. I think, and there are a lot of other structural changes increasing the minimum wage. We worked very hard to increase it a couple years ago and to index it to inflation, but I think we need to go much farther there as we think about the rates of inflation and the cost of living. So
Yeah,
there's
those are really good points. And as you point out, this is an active area of law here in New York State. Many people are working to strengthen these laws to protect workers from pay discrimination. What bills are currently being considered this year? You got your eye on some current legislation?
Yeah, absolutely. So we worked to enact the original pay transparency law, which went into effect in 2023. I don't, at that time, we weren't able to achieve everything we wanted. I think I talked about, right now we have a law on the books that requires equal pay for substantially similar work, but we are living in an environment where workers still, current employees cannot access information about how much they're being paid compared to their coworkers. And so I really find that to be an absurd reality. It's a protection that we've created that without teeth, without access to the information that makes that law meaningful. And so one of the things we're working on doing this session is pushing forth a bill that would amend our pay transparency law to require disclosure of pay ranges to existing employees so that an existing employee could go to their employer and get information on what the current wage range was for their position or substantially similar positions, so that they have the information they would essentially need to determine whether or not they're being paid fairly. That's one piece of that law. The goal of that law, that bill, I'm sorry, is also to expand disclosures to go beyond just base compensation to cover information about other forms of compensation. We know in so many fields and industries, people are compensated through bonuses and stock options and different methods that really are huge drivers of inequity. Sometimes people don't even know all those options are on the table. And so we think transparency with respect to those broader forms of compensation and with respect to benefits is really critical. I mean, then we always talk about how childcare, having to take leave for pregnancy and to raise newborn children results in huge financial penalties, and yet workers don't have access to the information up front, whether an employer provides paid family leave. So the more transparency we have, the more we empower workers to, close this gap.
Yeah, those are really good points. So we know at the federal level, the Trump administration has ongoing efforts to weaken the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, makes 150 million American workers more susceptible to discrimination on the basis of race. They can be denied a promotion based on their gender or sexual orientation, or be deprived of a needed accommodation for a disability. But here in New York, we have avenues to address these issues. Talk to us briefly about where people can go for help when they need it, Seher.
Yeah, I mean, even before the Trump administration came in, I think because we have more robust laws in New York State, it was always kind of one of the stronger avenues to utilize. And so one thing I will stress is that, I provided a very superficial overview of some of the legal protections that exist in New York State, but unfortunately, they can be quite complex. And so we always advise people to consult assistance from a lawyer and a legal advocate to get a better sense. And also because there are all these other procedural bars that prevent people from, accessing the courts. And sometimes there are time limitations on when you can file a complaint. And so at Legal Momentum, we have a national helpline where people can call to get more guidance. We take on only a small number of cases for litigation, but through our helpline, we provide referrals, we guide people through the process, we tell people where they can file complaints, and we try to help them access attorneys. And so if you go to legalmomentum.org, we have a help button. People can get the information for either calling our helpline, submitting, an online request, or just emailing us. So that's, I think, something that's important to note. I think alternatively, there are places that people can go directly. The New York State Department of Labor is the state agency tasked with enforcing our equal pay law, as well as, our pay transparency law, for example. And so people can go directly there to file complaints if they feel like their rights have been violated in those areas. The New York State Attorney General is an incredible advocate in the space, and is interested and has enforcement tools as well. And so, reaching out to the AG's office is always another option if people are seeking redress. I'm trying to think. And then I think just generally the New York State Division of Human Rights is responsible for enforcing our general anti-discrimination law, which prohibits discrimination in employment based on a number of protected characteristics. And so that's a place where you can, you can file an equal pay complaint, but you can always also bring that claim as a general anti-discrimination claim with the New York State Division of Human Rights. And then lastly, I'll mention local human rights and civil rights enforcement agencies. You may or may not have one in your county or locality, but it's always worth checking on, and that's something we can assist with too.
Yeah, those are all great suggestions. Thank you. Well, as you know, Equal Pay Day, although I like to call it Unequal Pay Day, is coming up on March 25th, and it's only the first of several this year because many different categories of employees face different days when they actually make enough money to equal what a man got the year before. So any final thoughts as we close up here, Seher? As I said, you've done a great job of kind of giving us the overview, and that there are always lots of details that need to be gone into in anyone's personal story. But really, your organization is here to help, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And Donna, we have a fact sheet on our website that goes through some of the laws in more detail that I talked about. But I think just to build on what you were saying, I would just note, as we all know, these are really dangerous times, I think, for women, not just with respect to pay, but on multiple fronts. I think we're under a current administration that is trying to tell people that we have gone too far in terms of protecting the rights of women and other marginalized groups, when in fact we really haven't even scratched the surface. I think it's really one of the key indicators of that. And as we have Equal Pay Day coming up, is that, women of color, Latinas make 51 cents for every dollar, and for a Black woman, it's 64 cents for every dollar that a white non-Hispanic man earns in this country right now nationally, and the figures are not that different for New York State. And so I think we are at a time where it's really essential to be bringing visibility to that fact, and to be calling on our leaders to really have courage to stand up, because we need to fight.
You're right. We need to stand up for ourselves. We need to stand up for our neighbors and our co-workers, and we need to stand up for everybody in this country who might be under the axe, so to speak, as so many of these protections are being whittled away before our eyes. Seher, thank you so much for coming in today. This has really been a great conversation. I will be sure to put your information in our show notes so that people can access some of the materials that you've talked about. And I hope we can ask you to come back again if we have another employment question that needs to be addressed. So thanks so much.
Donna, thank you. As I said, it's always a privilege talking with you and working with you. And
Well,
I was so glad to
thank
be here
you.
with you.
Right back at you, sister. So these conversations are a production of North Country Matters. This show is a civic collaboration between the League of Women Voters of St. Lawrence County and the Potsdam Public Library. Until next time, remember, our North Country matters, and so does your job. So you take care of it.